On the evening of May 5th, 1993, three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were reported missing in West Memphis, Arkansas. It was reported they were last spotted headed towards Robin Hood Hills, a small patch of woods in the area. To get there, the kids would pass through a dead-end street, walk the pipe bridge that crossed the 10-mile bayou, and head towards the path into the woods. Fear and panic struck the families who wondered where their children were. They, along with volunteers, searched the area into the wee hours of the night. The next day at around 8 a.m., police canvassed West Memphis, but focused mostly on Robin Hood Hills. That afternoon, the worst fears would be realized. Stevie, Michael, and Christopher were discovered in a ditch submerged in muddy water. They had been stripped naked and hogtied with their own shoelaces. Their small bodies were mutilated. Most of their clothes were discovered turned inside out, pinned down by sticks in the muddy ditch bed. The discovery rocked West Memphis. Police investigated as they checked truckers' logs, sex offender registries, questioned numerous people, which included a pair of young men who left the state for California shortly after. But on June 3rd, the investigation would lead to an arrest of three teenagers: Jessie Misskelley, Jason Baldwin, and Damien Echols. They were infamously known as the West Memphis Three. Jessie confessed to the crime, also implicating Damien, who was heavily into the occult, and his best friend Jason. In February of 1994, Jessie was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He would get 40 years. The following month, Damien and Jason were found guilty on 3 counts of murder. Jason would receive a life sentence, and Damien was sentenced to death. After the conviction, the West Memphis Three eventually became icons of an innocence movement. It started in 1996 with HBO's Paradise Lost, the childhood murders at Robin Hood Hills, and it eventually became a movement that assembled a large following that included popular entertainers like Johnny Depp, the Dixie Chicks, Eddie Vedder, Peter Jackson, and many more. The narrative goes, the West Memphis Three were poor, misunderstood outcasts in a modern-day Salem because they dressed in black, listened to Metallica, and read Stephen King novels. They were singled out and railroaded by the law enforcement and judicial system because they needed scapegoats to end the demand for justice from the pitchfork villagers of a Puritan southern town who suffered from satanic panic. Meanwhile, the real killer or killers were still out there. The narrative was later echoed by others such as author Mara Leverett and podcaster Bob Ruff and many more. The thing is, perception isn't always reality. The narrative set out and absorbed by the audience is very much a fiction. Even I, like many others, bought into their innocence, but my perception changed when I researched the case itself. After long hours of exhausted reading reports, police interviews, court transcripts, appeals, lab reports, and so on, I realized I was duped. I was angry about that. I was tricked by clever filmmakers and a multi-million-dollar post-conviction legal team defense. And let's not forget the Innocence Project, who was co-founded by a man who helped set O.J. Simpson free. This episode will cover Jessie, and Damien in separate segments. And so with that, let's get on with it. On June 3rd of 1993, Jessie Misskelley Jr. was brought into the West Memphis police station at 10 a.m. for questioning. Jessie knew Damien Echols, who was suspected of being involved in the murders of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, and the police were questioning anyone who knew him. Jessie wasn't the first to be interviewed, nor was he considered a suspect at the time. Now, before we get into that, let's address some misconceptions that is very popular in this West Memphis Three advocate community. It is believed that Jessie had a lack of due process and wasn't read his Miranda rights. An example given is from a musician and actor named Henry Rollins, who told a radio interviewer in 2003, and I quote, What was really interesting to me was the lack of due process that the three boys incarcerated did not enjoy and the lack of Miranda rights read to Jessie Misskelley. And I went, wow, that's not the way Americans should be treated. So, you see, inaccuracies like that are thrown into the echo chamber all the time in that West Memphis Three community, and it drives me nuts. So before we get into Jessie's interview and interrogation, let's go over some facts about how Jessie's rights were not violated and that the West Memphis Police Department did it by the book. So number one, Jessie's father, Jessie Misskelley Sr., spoke with Sergeant Mike Allen at 9:45 a.m. and again at 11:15 a.m. about the interview. Allen actually talked to Jessie Sr. first in the morning. Jessie Sr. then drove off and retrieved Jessie Jr. Then Allen and Jessie Jr. drove to the police station at 11:15 a.m. Jessie Sr. signed a waiver allowing police to give Jessie Jr. a polygraph exam. Number two, West Memphis Police did in fact inform Jessie Jr. of his rights. Sergeant Allen read Misskelley his legal rights at around 11 a.m. and Misskelley initialed and signed a rights form. Detective Durham advised Misskelley of his rights again at 11:30 a.m. before conducting the polygraph exam, and Misskelley again initialed and signed a rights form. Now, the second form is not available online, but it was discussed and entered into evidence as State's Exhibit 11 during a court hearing on January 13th, 1994. At the beginning of the first tape-recorded confession, police again reminded Misskelley of his legal rights and reviewed and signed the rights form. So, there you go. And number three, Jessie Jr. did in fact understand his legal rights because he was in fact in legal trouble before. Jessie Jr.'s lawyers tried claiming that Misskelley was incapable of reading or understanding his legal rights, and thus that his June 3rd, 1993 confession should be thrown out. Prosecutors countered that Misskelley had extensive experience dealing with law enforcement officials before June 1993, and that Misskelley had been Mirandaized and signed legal rights waivers on 4 previous occasions. Now that we have that factual understanding, let's move on. According to notes made by detectives Mike Allen and Brian Ridge, Jessie stated that he worked as a roofer on the day of the murders. After work, Jessie claimed that he went home and stayed home for the night. An interesting statement since he claimed later he was out of town wrestling at some event. This was the first of many inconsistent alibis made by Jessie or for Jessie. Jessie told the detectives that he had heard a rumor that Damien Echols and Robert Birch killed Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, and Christopher Byers. He said he didn't know Birch very well, but he knew Damien. He introduced Damien to Vicky Hutchinson. He went on to describe Damien's close relationship with Jason Baldwin. He said that they were always together and that Damien also had a pregnant girlfriend named Dominique. Jessie also said that he always saw Damien at the local skating rink with friends Jason and another kid named Carl Smith. Jessie attempted to distance himself from Damien by calling him sick and that he drank or licked human blood. He made inconsistent statements about the last time he met or spoke to Damien. In one statement, he claimed it was 3 weeks. In another, it was 2 months. Suspicions started to mount on Jessie. Jessie was asked if he'd take a polygraph test, and he agreed. I mean, what could he say, right? If he says no, he looks suspicious. But then he thinks, maybe I can beat it. Now, after the polygraph test was conducted, Bill Durham told Brian Ridge and Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell that Jessie was lying his ass off. Now, I want to share my opinion that I don't find polygraphs very reliable. It's a big reason why they're not admissible in court. Still, it's an investigative tool, and sometimes the psychology that comes from it can help elicit a response. However, guilty people have passed polygraphs and innocent people have failed them, so I'm not using them as any kind of proof, but I will report on them as we go along, just to be fair. The detectives pushed harder, believing Jessie wasn't being truthful with them. They showed Jessie a photo of one of the boys on an autopsy table just to get a response, and they played a tape recording of a boy who eerily said, "Nobody knows what happened but me." The boy on the recording was Aaron Hutchinson, an 8-year-old boy who Jessie babysat for and who was friends with the 3 murder victims, and also was the son of Vicky Hutchinson. I don't want to get too off topic, but I felt Vicky, for the most part, played an unhelpful role in the investigation along with her son, something we'll discuss in later episodes. However, this recording was powerful because, as far as Jessie knew, Aaron could have witnessed everything without knowing it at the time. Instead of being confused or appalled by the recording and professing his innocence, Jessie instead broke down crying and confirmed he was present during the murders. Jessie was interrogated for about 2 hours before confessing, and not the 12 hours as claimed by the filmmakers of the Paradise Lost series, or even the Innocence Project. They get it wrong on their website, showing they must be getting their information from unreliable sources. But I digress. Jessie arrived at the station at 10 a.m. and confessed at 2:20 p.m. Only a little over 2 hours of that time was actual interrogation. Jessie was initially vague and incorrect about a lot of details in his first confession. He even lied multiple times about the timing of the murders, about how the boys were tied and how they died. West Memphis Three supporters in the defense would use this to prove Jessie was coerced into a confession. But look, the initial lies here were not due to that. Jessie had a reason to lie, and he explained so several times, and we will get into that later. For now, let me address some of the things that he got wrong and some of the things that he got right. In his first recorded statement, Misskelley initially said that he met Damien and Jason at 9 a.m. Later, he said that the killings took place around noon and that the 3 victims had skipped school that day. In the second recorded statement, Misskelley changed the time to 5 or 6, then changed it again to 7 or 8, then added, "I remember it was starting to get dark. In fact, all 3 victims attended school that day and were last seen alive at around 6:30 p.m. Misskelley described seeing Baldwin or Echols kill Byers, the Byers boy, by choking him with a large stick. The autopsy showed no evidence of choking. In his second recorded statement, Misskelley said that Damien and Jason tied up the 3 victims with brown rope. No brown rope was used to tie the boys. The victims were actually tied up by their own shoelaces. Misskelley repeatedly tried to end his story by claiming, "And then I left," only to continue recounting what happened next. Now, Misskelley said he saw Baldwin and Echols anally raping the Byers and Branch boys, but the autopsy couldn't definitively conclude that despite the dilation, so it can't be 100% conclusive. There was possible evidence of semen present on the clothing of one of the victims, but the water ditch had destroyed much of the DNA evidence. It's most likely some sexual assault took place, but it may not have involved anal rape. Or maybe it did, it's inconclusive. Now, Misskelley confessed to chasing down Michael Moore, who was trying to escape, and bringing him back to the scene of the crime, a statement that would be relevant since Moore was discovered farther away from Byers and Branch, a detail not known publicly at the time. Misskelley correctly identified which boy had been cut on his face, that was Branch, which boy had been cut on his groin, that was Byers, and which boy had not been cut at all, and that was Moore. There were widespread rumors that one victim was sexually mutilated. However, the details of each victim's injuries had not been made public at that time. After Jessie's confession, he would be arrested along with Damien and Jason, and they were charged with the murders of Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore. As stated in the last episode, Jessie would be tried separately from Damien and Jason. Jessie would recant his confession. The West Memphis Three pled not guilty, and since there was a worry that the case would be branded as an example of satanic panic, the trial was moved over an hour away to Corning, Arkansas, in order to give a better shot at seating, fair and unbiased juries for Jessie. And then it'll be Jonesboro for Damien and Jason. So on February 5th, 1994, Misskelley was convicted by a jury of one count of first degree murder and two counts of second degree murder. The court sentenced him to life plus 40 years in prison. So after conviction, something interesting happened. Deputy John Moody wrote a letter to Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell. I'll try to read this the best that I can, but the writing isn't exactly, it's just not exactly well written. But I'll do my best to read it clearly. Maybe even try to clean up some of the grammar mistakes. I'll do my best. So the letter reads: on the afternoon of February 4th, 1994, Deputy James Lindsay and myself were transporting Jessie Misskelley to the Arkansas Department of Corrections at Pine Bluff. Jessie was asked if there was anything he wanted to say, and after being assured we would not use anything he said against him in court, he chose to talk. Jessie advised he had received a call from Jason Baldwin asking him if he wanted to go to West Memphis to get some girls. Jessie, Damien, and Jason met at a local road on May 5th, sometime that evening. Jessie claimed that he had been drinking Evan Williams whiskey that Mrs. Hutchinson had bought him, and Jason and Damien, they were drinking beer. It was also stated that they had smoked 2 marijuana joints that afternoon. Jessie said that he had known Jason Baldwin since the 6th grade and did not know Damien that well, but that Damien would drink human blood, remembering a time when Jason was bleeding and Damien took some of the blood with his finger and licked it off. Jessie stated that Officer Callahan had lied in court about not seeing him on May 5th. Jessie claims they had a short conversation. After all of them were meeting on the road, the 3 boys walked into the woods and were sitting in the water with Jason and Damien going under. Jessie said he could not go under because of his ear problem. The 3 young boys were seen from a distance when Damien told Jessie and Jason to hide. Jessie said they were hiding behind bushes when Damien grabbed Michael Moore. The 2 other young boys started hitting Damien, trying to help their friend, and that is when Jessie and Jason jumped out and helped Damien beat them. Jessie advised he helped hold them and beat them, but had no part in raping and killing them. Jessie advised 2 of the boys were raped from behind before and after they were tied up, and that Damien and Jason were taking turns with the 2 boys. Jessie said the boys were still alive at this time. Jessie said the boys were kept quiet by putting hands over their mouths, and that Jason and Damien had used shirts and that faces were pushed down to the ground. Jessie was asked how the boys were kept under control while being raped and not tied yet, and he stated, "They were like puppies. When you whoop a puppy and tell it to stay, it will." Jessie did say he had to catch Michael Moore, but did not say at what point. Jessie claims that the 3rd boy was never raped, but that he may have been the one that Damien took his penis and put it in his mouth, the young boy's penis. Jessie said at one point Damien and Jason had one of the boys in a headlock, with one he believed had his penis in the boy's mouth, while the other one had from behind. Again, this is where sometimes the writing doesn't become very clear. Jessie said he did not mention the ears to the police, only the headlock. Jessie also mentioned that sticks had been used to beat the boys. At one point, Jessie said that Jason had a buck-type locking knife and cut it off and threw it in the weeds, in which I'm assuming they're talking about the scrotum and the skin of the penis of one of the boys, saying the boy was alive and tied at this point, and that he was surprised blood did not get on him, and because blood went everywhere and he was about a car length away. Jessie said they threw him into the water and he was still squirming around in the water, at which point he left. Jessie said he does not know what happened to the knife. Jessie said he believed that the other 2 boys were not conscious when he left, but were not in the water. Jessie also stated that Jason called him later and asked him why he left, and he told them that he told them he could not watch it any longer. He claims the only other contact with Jason and Damien were a couple of times at the skating rink, but that they were mad at him. And here's some other information that was shared. Jesse claims his lawyer asked him if he was innocent, and he said that he lied to him. Jesse said he lied about the brown robe to trick the police and to see if they were lying. Jesse says he feels that Damien and Jason tricked him into what he did. Jesse claims he felt sorry for what happened and talks as if he wants to testify against the other boys so that they will not go free, which later he decided not to do. Jesse did say one photograph, or one of the photographs shown to him in the interrogation, was a group picture of the boys riding their bicycles in front of a house. The claims made by the officers would be validated by Jesse again on February 8th and February 17th of 1994. Here's something Jesse said to one of the prosecutors, Brent Davis, about why he lied. And this was an interview done on February 17th, 1994. So Jessie Misskelley tells Brent Davis, "We tied him up." Davis responds, "Okay, now you said before when police asked you in their statement and asked you what they were tied up with, and you said they were tied up with rope." Jesse answers, "I made that up." And Davis asks, "Why?" And Misskelley responds with, "Try to get off, get him off track." Jesse confessed to his own attorney, Dan Stidham, in February of 1994 twice. Against the advice of his attorney, Jesse would also confess to the prosecuting attorneys without any deal of any kind. When asked why, Jesse said, "I want something done about it." The confessions he makes to his attorney under his own free will is pretty well detailed and uncoursed. In total, Jesse confessed to police, his attorney, and the prosecutors a total of 6 times. These dates include June 3rd, June 11th, and August 19th of 1993, and February 4th, February 8th, and February 17th of 1994. And those are just the official documented and recorded confessions. There's speculation he may have confessed more, but just not substantiated, so I don't really want to go into it. Now, Jesse stated repeatedly to police in confessions that he felt sorry for his role in the murders of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher. Jesse said he cried multiple times due to the overwhelming amount of guilt, and his statement would be corroborated by his father's at the time girlfriend, Lee Rush. So, shortly after police arrested Jessie Misskelley Jr., law enforcement went to Jesse's trailer with a search warrant. Lee told several officers that when she would wake up at night several times to Jesse crying loudly. This is what she said in her own words. "I knew that something was wrong. A few nights ago, little Jesse was in his room crying so loud and sobbing so hard that it woke me up. I went in and asked him what was wrong. His reply was that his girlfriend was moving to Florida." Now, Lee Rush wasn't buying that, and for good reason. It should be noted that Jesse Jr.'s girlfriend, Susie Brewer, she didn't move to Florida. It just didn't happen. It was a lie. And it shows correlation between Jesse's crying, after the murders, to Jesse listening to Aaron's recording. If you watch the first Paradise Lost, you can feel the tension between Lee Rush and Jesse Sr. Jesse Sr. was sticking with his son, right or wrong, where Lee felt that if he was found guilty, he wanted nothing to do with him. She expressed she would feel the exact same way if it were her own son. Shortly after this was filmed, the relationship with Jesse Sr. and Lee Rush came to an end. In addition to Jesse Jr.'s multiple confessions, he would also have no credible alibi during the time frame of the murders. In fact, Jesse Jr.'s alibi changed, if not by his own account, then by his father, Jesse Sr. Jesse Sr. was interviewed by news reporters days later after his son's arrest. A reporter from KAIT TV asked him if his son could have been with Damien and Jason on the night of the murders. Jesse Sr. stated that was a possibility, but that his son didn't murder anyone. Jesse's father would later claim that his son was actually at home and remembered seeing him at 7:15 p.m. that night as his son was preparing to go wrestle. The timing of Jesse Sr.'s statement was challenged by his teacher, Gloria Wilson, at the alcohol safety class he attended for DWI violations. According to the teacher, class didn't get out until at least 15 minutes to 8, making it impossible for Jesse Sr. to have seen Jesse Jr. at 7:15 p.m. There was also a wrestling alibi that would also be proven false. Fred Revell, pro wrestler, gave a detailed account of what happened on the day of the murders. He claimed Jesse was with the wrestling crew that evening. One piece of detailed statement that would debunk that claim involved a check and a receipt. Fred stated that he had to give $300 to a man named Charles Stone for a wrestling ring he purchased. Fred claimed he wrote the check on May 5th of 1993, the day of the murders. And he was given a receipt and that the check was deposited the next day. That's what Fred said, but the receipt was actually dated April 27th, a little over a week before the murders. Now, another piece of crucial information involves the Evan Williams whiskey bottle. Jesse claimed he was drinking Evan Williams whiskey on the evening of the murders. It played an important role in the case to substantiate Jesse's involvement. Jesse told his attorney, Dan Stidham, that after the murders, he was mad at what Damien and Jason did to the three boys, especially when he witnessed them mutilate Christopher. Jesse stated after he left, he smashed that Evan Williams whiskey bottle on an overpass between Walmart and Lakeshore out of anger. Here is a statement by prosecutor Brent Davis during the Echols-Baldwin hearing on February 22, 1994. To quote Mr. Stidham, I believe at the time, if we can find a bottle like he says, then that will convince me that it happened. At 9:30 or 10 at night, we drive. At 10 o'clock in the evening, we proceed, the four of us, to roam underneath the overpass of West Memphis, and lo and behold, find a broken bottle in the location indicated by his client, which of course is Jesse. We then take the bottle to a local liquor store, where we proceed to spend the better part of an hour matching the bottle with certain items. And lo and behold, it matches the brand name bottle Mr. Stidham had indicated that we should be looking for in the first place. At that point, Mr. Stidham says, that wasn't good. It just wasn't good enough to convince him. Additional efforts were made. There was a week hiatus where there was no contact apparently. Jesse stated that Vicky Hutchinson bought him the bottle of Evan Williams whiskey on the day of the murders, and this would be verified by Vicky herself. Jesse would confess, recant, and reconfess several times before and after his trial. Ultimately, Jesse decided he was not going to testify at Damien and Jason's trial. So why would Jesse recant? It's not uncommon, actually, especially when you weigh what the right thing to do is versus freedoms and self-preservation. Ted Bundy confessed to over 100 murders, but later recanted. John Wayne Gacy would also confess to murders, but later recanted. Murderers have a tendency to do what is in their best interest, or why else would they go to trial? And if found guilty, why would they appeal? Jesse's recantment is not grounds for innocence. So let's talk about Jesse's low IQ score. Jesse's low IQ score of 72 is often brought up to prove that he was tricked into confessing. Jesse's defense team gave him an IQ test and tried to depict Jesse as borderline mentally retarded. It would be noted that Dan Stidham was upfront about the test and how a lower score could be beneficial to his client's case because it could possibly remove a death penalty sentence. Part of this discussion can be seen on Paradise Lost, the childhood murders at Robin Hood Hills. It's not out of the realm of possibility to assume that Jessie could have tried to score poorly on purpose, something brought up during Dr. William Wilkins' cross-examination, the doctor who scored Jessie. Jessie's IQ score may not even reveal borderline mental retardation at all, but instead a lack of effort on his part. In Maura Levitt's book Devil's Knot, page 70, Jessie stated that he did poorly in school and dropped out because he simply didn't care anymore. He figured he would be a mechanic like his father. What Jessie lacked in higher learning, he made up for in street smarts, especially when it came to understanding his Miranda rights. It all came down to what Jessie wanted to learn. You have to have a skill and knowledge to fix a car. I mean, it takes learning. So in conclusion, it is without any doubt that Jessie Misskelley is guilty based on the solid circumstantial evidence and the direct evidence of his confession. The alibis made by Jessie, his father, and friends have been proven false to presumably try and protect him. Jessie placed himself at the crime and he had no reliable alibi. And even though he wasn't initially truthful about all the details, he would later offer relevant insight to what happened that only those who were there would know. We probably won't ever get to see the entire puzzle, but we at least see enough pieces to know what the picture is. Jessie minimized his involvement, and we won't know how much he truly participated in, but we do know he participated in beating those boys, those poor boys, and he chased and got Michael Moore back. He only confessed and wanted to do something about it after he was interrogated by police and after he was convicted. While this part is not directly linked to the murders, it does show how Jessie is capable of hurting children. I want you to hear this. In March 1993, Jessie was arrested for punching Tiffany Danielle Allen, a 13-year-old girl, in the face. In a statement given after his arrest to the West Memphis Police Department, Dennis Carter, a friend of Misskelley's, reported an incident in which Misskelley chased down a 6-year-old girl, striking her in the head with a rock. That poor little girl cried while Jessie laughed. But this is the guy that the West Memphis Three advocates want you to think is innocent and was tricked into a confession. Yeah, okay. Damien Echols. It's popularly believed that he was one of the 3 falsely convicted of murder because he dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music, and read Stephen King novels. It is widely accepted that satanic panic was the primary reason why Damien was found guilty. This belief is heavily enforced by the Paradise Lost series, the Devil's Knot book, and a cast of famous people sympathetic to the West Memphis Three cause. They believe that Damien was just a mere depressed, misunderstood bright kid in an ignorant southern judgmental Christian town who scorned him simply because he dressed differently and liked other interests. Now, according to Damien, West Memphis was second Salem, and he was a victim in their modern-day witch hunt. Okay, now call me crazy, but I'm pretty sure the prosecutors of the West Memphis Three trials didn't use spectral evidence to convict them like they did in Salem back in the day. Some of you are probably asking, what the hell is spectral evidence? Well, Joan Johnson Lewis of ThoughtCode.com explains it really well. Spectral evidence is evidence based on visions and dreams of actions of a witch's spirit or specter. The spectral evidence is testimony about what an accused person's spirit did, rather than the actions of the accused person in the body. In the Salem witch trials, spectral evidence was used as evidence in the courts, especially in the early trials. If a witness could testify seeing the spirit of someone and could testify to interacting with that spirit, perhaps even bargaining with that spirit, that was considered evidence that the person possessed had consented to the possession and thus was responsible. Okay, I'm 100% confident that spectral evidence was not used to convict Damien Echols, hence voiding the lunacy of this being another Salem witch trial. I'm also certain that West Memphis didn't attribute all other crimes to Satanism. However, what we do see, if we dig deeper, we'll see a violent, disturbed kid with documented health problems along with suicidal and homicidal tendencies. Let's discuss what led up to the murders. Right? On May 29th of 1992, nearly a year before the murders, Damien was arrested for burglary and sexual misconduct after trying to run away with a girl named Deanna Holcomb, his girlfriend at the time. During the arrest, Damien threatened to kill the officer who made the arrest and Deanna's father. Later, Damien told caseworkers that he made a suicide pact with Deanna if they couldn't be together. How Romeo and Juliet. Jerry Driver, a juvenile probation officer, along with Detective John Murray, questioned Damien. Damien denied being a Satanist, but he did admit he was involved in the occult. He described himself as a gray witch, a witch that is in the middle of white and black witchcraft. Basically, he saw himself neutral between good and evil. Damien explained to Jerry that he did have a group that would meet and that his main participant was his best friend, Jason Baldwin. He also boasted that Jason would never give him up, which was confirmed in Damien's autobiography entitled Life After Death. Jason knew of Damien and Deanna's plan to run away together and was with them part of the day, helping them. Damien's violent acts and threats would only get worse. In addition to threatening to kill Deanna's father and the arresting police officer, Damien threatened to kill former friend Shane Divilbus, the person Deanna dated after her split with Damien. In school, Damien attacked Shane and tried to gouge out his eye. In Damien's autobiography, Life After Death, Damien denied this act, claiming his finger accidentally slipped and grabbed onto Shane's eye, but his book contradicted his statements in his medical records. In a discharge summary on June 25, 1992, he admits to violence and trying to remove Shane's eye. This is one of many examples of Damien trying to minimize his actions while he was in prison and after his release. He doesn't want the populace to know about the real him or who he was. He wants you to see this facade, this poor, misunderstood guy at the time. Shane would also have some interesting insights on Damien. He claimed that Damien was an imposing person and that his friends feared him. He stated that if you disagreed with Damien, his glance could quickly silence them with intimidation. Now, Damien also threatened to kill his mother and father. After leaving Charter Hospital of Little Rock in 1992, his parents moved him to Oregon because Pam, Damien's mother, believed that he was into some strange activities such as witchcraft, and she also didn't like the quality of friends that he had in Arkansas. In September of 1992, Damien's parents called the police. They no longer felt safe around their unstable son. Damien made statements that he was going to kill himself and others. He threatened to commit suicide in various ways. Damien also threatened to cut his mother's throat, and also made verbal threats to kill his father. In March of 1993, 14-year-old Jennifer Ball stated an incident with Damien. She was in her kitchen on the phone when all of a sudden Damien appeared outside her window, telling her she was going to die. An incident report was filed and is on record. This was a little over 2 months before the murders. Soon after Damien threatened Jennifer's life, he went to 13-year-old Amanda Lancaster's house to stalk and intimidate. According to Amanda, she stated that Heather Cleet, Jason Baldwin's girlfriend, told her that Damien had been asking about her. He asked Heather about Amanda's phone number and address. After the child murders, Amanda reported that at the local skating rink, Damien would follow her and Jennifer around, stalking them, and threatened that they were the next two to die. On May 24th, at a softball field, multiple different girls heard Damien claim he murdered Stevie, Christopher, and Michael. He went on to say that he planned on killing two more people before turning himself in. He claimed that he already had one of them picked out. Some of these girls include Christophe Van Vickel, Katie Hendricks, Jody Medford, Jessica Medford, Jackie Medford, and Katie LaFoy. Donna Medford, the mother of Jody, Jessica, and Jackie, also made a statement regarding Damien's softball field confessions. Based on the statements before and after the murders, I think it's pretty solid to believe that it's possible Amanda Lancaster and Jennifer Ball may have been on Damien's list. In trial, Damien admitted being at the softball field, but denied making those remarks, calling the girls liars. Years after being long convicted, in a prison interview, he admitted that he probably did say it, but it was a joke. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it perjury to lie on the stand? Okay, so Heather Cleet made a statement that Damien told her that he stuck a stick in a dog's eye, jumped on it, and burned it. Joe Bartosh, Jason's cousin, witnessed the torture and killing of the dog. So you have two different collaborating statements that can't really be dismissed or passed off as hearsay. You have one who heard about it and one who saw it happen. These weren't just mere acquaintances or just casual friends. You have one who was the actual girlfriend of Jason Baldwin and one who was his cousin. What purpose would that be to lie, especially if it hurts Jason at trial? Now, a dog skull was found in Damien's house on May 19th, 1992, after running away with Deanna. Damien claimed in trial that he and his stepfather found it on the side of the road. Now, some will say that the dog killing is conjecture, and fair enough, but consider these two things. Damien's lies and how he minimizes versus his actual track record. Weigh the two out. What is more plausible? It should also be noted that days after being arrested for the murders of Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, Damien attempted suicide on June 9th, 1993. He hoarded medicine he was supposed to take daily while in jail. He consumed 12 pills at once. He left a suicide note. He was then placed in a holding tank until proper authorities could be notified. An ER doctor advised they give Damien a syrup that would help him vomit out the medication. This really just shows you that this was a person who not only was homicidal, but was suicidal and was mentally not well. I would like to go back to how Damien stalked people. As previously stated, he stalked Jennifer Ball and Amanda Lancaster, be it at their homes or out in public. Here's an interesting statement Jessie made to Detective Ridge. He talked about how Damien had a briefcase. In it was drugs and photographs of the boys in front of a house. Now, let's stop there. Let's see if we can see a connection. Let's just see if there's anything outside of Jessie's confession that can validate this. Now, Melissa Byers, the mother of Christopher, made a statement to police on October 5th, 1993, regarding a man taking pictures of her son in front of her house. Let me read it in her own words. Sometime around last of February 1993 or the 1st of March 1993, my husband and myself went down to the corner grocery flash market on Ingram Boulevard. We left Ryan and Christopher home. Christopher was playing out under the carport. We returned about 20 minutes later, and Christopher came outside telling us a man had taken his picture. When questioned about it, Christopher told us the man had on a black coat, pants, shoes. He also had black hair. I asked him if the man talked to him or tried to grab him. He told me no, however, the man scared him, and he ran into the yard to get away from him. He told me the man took his picture, got into his car, and left. He told me the man had a green car. Now, this is where West Memphis Three supporters will say that Damien, doesn't know how to drive or he doesn't have a license, at least at that time. That doesn't mean anything. Jessie also stated to Ridge that Damien would drive Jack Echols' car. In case you're not paying attention, people have a tendency to do things that are against the law. Now, some will argue that Jack's car was red and not green, but see, these are kind of minor details. We just know that if Damien needed to drive, he could drive. You don't throw the proverbial baby out of the bathwater. So, is Melissa making up a story? Was there another possible explanation? Well, Melissa thought maybe it was someone at the mortgage company at the time, since they were having some financial troubles with their house. They thought maybe someone came to take pictures, so she contacted them to ask, and they responded that they haven't been out there since August of 1992. So that possibility was ruled out. So let's take a look at another incident. 11-year-old Jessica Bryant and her parents went to the West Memphis Police Department to report a stalking incident, which Jessica stated happened about 2 months before the murders, putting it around March. According to her statement, she said, "It was a Sunday, and we were just running around talking to each other, and this boy just came up walking down the street, and he was dressed in all black, and so we were just playing, and we looked over, and there we saw him. He was behind the bush, and so we weren't really paying attention to him. We didn't think anything was going to happen, so we continued playing, and then he was still there. So we went over and we hid behind this car for a few minutes, and we thought, he won't come out. So we go away, and he leaves us alone. And we went back, and he was still there. And so he was looking out of the corner of his eyes at us. And so we didn't know what to do. So we went inside and told my mama, and he started running off. And then we don't know what happened to him." So let's take all that information from multiple sources. We have Jessie Misskelley, who stated Damien had photos of victims in a briefcase. We have Melissa Byers, stating her son told her that a man all dressed in black was photographing him sometime in February or March of 1993. We have Jennifer Ball and Amanda Lancaster, who talked about an incident of stalking and threats in March of 1993. We then have Jessica Bryant stating that she was being watched by Damien in March of 1993. We see a clear and distinct pattern of behavior that you simply cannot ignore. Let's move on to Damien's taste for blood. Human blood. His fetish for consuming blood is extensively documented in a 500-page document called Exhibit 500. The documents are a long list of Damien's mental health records that were presented by his lawyers to convince the jury not to give him the death penalty by persuading the jurors that he was mentally ill. While at Charter Hospital of Little Rock back in June of 1992, Damien would suck blood off of peers who had scratched themselves. In September of the same year, Damien was in the Craighead County Juvenile Detention Center. While there, another juvenile cut his wrists. Damien grabbed the kid by one of his wrists and sucked the blood from the open wound. He then smeared the blood on his face and proclaimed he was a devil-worshipping vampire. He was immediately placed in isolation and suicide watch. Damien stated to one social worker that he believed in vampires and that he worshipped the devil. He told another counselor that drinking blood gave him power and that it made him feel like a god. In addition to Jessie's many confessions, others have witnessed Damien's taste for blood. Tiffany Allen witnessed a fight between Jason Baldwin and this other boy. After the fight, Jason bled, and Damien wiped Jason's blood off with his finger and put it in his mouth. Damien made it clear during an interview that he doesn't drink blood, but licks it. An irrelevant statement because whether he's drinking, sucking, or licking, he's consuming human blood. Now let's go over Damien's take on the murders. On May 9th, 1993, Detective Brian Ridge and Shane Griffin visited Damien, Jason, and Dominique at the front of Jason's residence. They asked Damien his thoughts on the murders. Damien believed whoever committed the crime was sick and did it as a thrill kill. He said that the penis was a symbol of power and that the number three was sacred in the Wicca religion. He said the murdered boys probably died of mutilation and drowning. He assumed one was cut up worse than the others and that the purpose of the murder was to scare someone. Damien claimed only one person committed the murders because if there were more, someone would eventually confess. Boy, would that statement ever come back to bite him in the ass. When asked how the person felt after committing the murders, Damien answered that the person probably felt good because they had the power to do what they did by taking life. When asked why he thought the boys were so young, Damien answered that the younger the victim, the more innocent they were, and that it gave the murderer more power. Damien believed that the killer knew that the kids went into the woods and that maybe the murderer asked them to come into the woods. He said that the boys were not big or smart and would be easily controlled. He said that the killer would not be concerned with the screams due to it being in the woods and that the killer wanted to hear the children scream. Damien believed that the killer was local and didn't care if he or she was caught because they thought it was funny. When asked what items the cops should be looking for at the crime scene, Damien answered candles, crystals, and a knife. Now, here is one bit of information that is mind-blowing. Damien told Detective Ridge on May 10th that juvenile parole officer Steve Jones told him that testicles had been cut off and someone had urinated in their mouths of the boys and that the bodies had been placed in the water to flush it out. Here's what's incriminating. There's no way Jones could have known that. No one. Not even Chief Inspector Gary Gitchell knew, until May 16th when he was phoned by Dr. Frank Peretti, the state forensic pathologist, and was told urine was discovered in the stomachs of 2 out of the 3 boys. There's no possible way Damien Echols could have known something so case-specific. How could he? I mean, how could he, but not Chief Inspector Gitchell or the detectives? It's absurd on its face. Damien's take on the murders was eerily similar to what happened at the crime scene. He would be questioned at his trial by prosecutor Brent Davis. When asked where Damien heard about the details, he claimed he read about them in the commercial appeal. Problem is, that information was never in the commercial appeal. Davis accused Damien of changing his explanations to conveniently fit the circumstances, and Damien agreed. Damien was constantly changing his story. Now let's get into Damien's alibis. Damien claimed that he was on the phone with several girls that night. He claimed to be on the phone with Dominique Tier, Heather Cleet, Holly George, and Jennifer Burden. Although he did talk to these girls that night, the time frame doesn't create a compelling alibi. Damien claimed he talked to Holly that evening. That's not true. He talked to her in the afternoon around 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. Damien claimed he talked to Heather, but it wasn't until 10:30 p.m. he told her that he was walking around with Jason. Damien parted ways with Dominique around 5 o'clock or 5:30 p.m. The next time she spoke with him was around 10 p.m. Damien spoke with Jennifer sometime after 9:20 p.m. However, it's quite possible it was a little later than that. Before, Jennifer called Damien before 5:30 p.m. and she stated that Damien told her that he and Jason were going somewhere. She called Damien's house at 8 o'clock p.m. and was told that he wasn't home. Later, Damien changed his story and claimed that he gave his mother instructions to tell her he wasn't home because Dominique was over. Based on Dominique's accounts of where she was that night, she wasn't with Damien during that time frame. So who's lying, Damien or Dominique? Dominique was firmly behind Damien throughout the investigation and the trial, so there's nothing for her to gain by lying in her statement. Diane Tier, Dominique's mother, would also confirm she arrived home at 7 p.m. So far, what we could take from that is that Damien was with Jason. So from 5:30 p.m. to after 9:20 p.m., but possibly later, Damien implicated himself along with Jason by telling others he walked around with his best friend that night. This contradicts his statement that he was on the phone with them during the time frame of the murders. Here's an interesting witness testimony. At 9:45 p.m., the Hollingsworth family, who knew Damien, testified that they saw him walking near the crime scene covered in mud on the night of the murders. They claimed Dominique was with him. Now, it's fair to point out that the Hollingsworth family, I think, mistook Dominique for Jason. They had long, similar hair, they had the same build, and it was dark, and they were described as muddy. Besides that, multiple records state Jason was with Damien, so that's the one constant we have. In addition to Damien's lies, Pam Hutchinson, his mother, claimed that he was with the family during the time frame of the murders. She claimed that they all had supper and then went to a friend's house. After that, they returned home and Damien was there the entire night, talking on the phone from 7:30 p.m. to 11 o'clock p.m. Pam claimed one of the people he spoke to that night was Jason. However, Damien also claimed he was with Dominique and wouldn't take Jennifer's phone call because of it. Dominique certainly doesn't remember, so what's the truth here? Again, the story changes in order to help Damien. Here's an example of Damien admitting when cross-examined by Davis. So Davis states, "Your mother testified that when you were down at the police station, one of the things she told you was you got some alibis, correct?" Damien responds, "Yes." Davis asks, "She testified that the same day the police talked to you, or maybe it was your sister, that is when you first started discussing along with the family about the details of the alibis, correct?" Damien responds, "Yes, sir." Davis asks, "When the police talk with you on the 10th, at the point in time you tell them from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. is when you think you were at the Sanders. Is that right?" Damien responds, "I probably told him that then." Davis asks, "That was about 5 days after the boys had turned up missing that you told them it was around 3 or 5 p.m. Damien responds, "I probably told him that if it's in the report." Davis asks, "When your mom tells him something, it's about 5 or 6 or 5 or 6:30, okay?" Damien nods his head. Davis asks, "As the time moves on and the time period that is in question becomes later in the evening, the visit to the Sanders becomes later in the evening, correct?" Damien responds, "Yes, sir." Davis asks, "So the story kind of changes to fit the facts we need to cover, right?" Damien responds, "Yes, sir." It is clear that Damien and Pam are not being truthful because all 4 girls Damien claimed to have talked to that night didn't occur around the times he claimed. So who's lying? The 4 girls or Damien and Pam? Is it responsible to believe the girls lied? Dominique was Damien's girlfriend and the mother of his child. Heather was Jason's girlfriend, so what would her motive be? Jennifer was very close with Damien. Holly was friends with Damien and Dominique. Again, what's the truth? They can't all be true, yet all are presented by Damien as evidence for an alibi, which all falls apart. Okay, let's talk about if Damien knew about the Robin Hood Hills crime scene. In prison interviews years after his conviction, he told multiple interviewers he lived in Marion and not West Memphis, which he said was about 15 to 20 miles away from the crime scene. He told interviewers he didn't spend a great deal of time in West Memphis unless it was to go to Walmart or the grocery store. He claimed not to be familiar with the Robin Hood Hills location. Let's see if his comments hold up. Damien, in fact, lived in West Memphis, and in fact testified in court he lived at the Broadway trailer park in West Memphis, which was within 2 miles of the crime scene. Damien also testified he walked in the neighborhood about 2 to 3 times a week. Also worth noting that Robin Hood Hills was the halfway meeting point between Damien's residence and Jason's. Perhaps the most compelling part of his lies is the fact that he lived at the Mayfair Apartments as a child for a time that overlooked Robin Hood Hills. He even talked about it in his book, Almost Home. Going back to the Hollingsworth family, 16-year-old Tabitha Hollingsworth told Detective Dabbs in an interview that it wasn't unusual to see Damien and Jason at the location of Robin Hood Hills. She described them often walking around 10 Mile Bayou, the large body of water which ran under the pipe bridge. She said they go back there to the river all the time. The fact that the media and West Memphis Three advocates overlooked this is nothing short of embarrassing for them. Damien clearly lied as much as he is able to minimize his involvement to the point that it's not even clever but painfully obvious. How does someone overlook this? Okay, so let's talk about Damien's criminal motivation. Was his influence occult motivated or simply a thrill kill? Maybe a mixture of the two? I believe the state prosecutors overplayed the occult or satanic ritual side motive, but let's understand proof of motive is not required in a criminal prosecution. In determining the guilt of a criminal defendant, courts are generally not concerned with why the defendant committed the alleged crime, but whether the defendant committed the crime. However, it may not be completely baseless that Damien had an occult motive. Let's talk about child sacrifice and Aleister Crowley and how that relates to Damien Echols. Damien denied being into black witchcraft and claimed to be either a white or gray witch, but Deanna claimed her ex-boyfriend lied about being a white and gray witch. She stated that he was very much into black witchcraft. Perhaps Deanna's most disturbing statement was this: I ran away with Damien. I went to a hospital in Memphis and he went to one in Little Rock. I found out that he planned to kill our firstborn if it was a girl. Damien would not do it. He is too much of a coward and would have tried to get me to do it. That's when I knew he was nuts and I had nothing else to do with him. I met Damien at school. I read some of his poems and I felt sorry for him. Deanna saw Damien as too much of a coward to commit murder, but apparently his intent of having others to do it was certainly there. Little did she know he was fully capable of being a participant. Chris Luttrell, a Wiccan and a friend of Damien's, stated that Damien had planned to sacrifice the baby of another girlfriend, Dominique Tier, but decided against it due to getting a bigger government check due to his Social Security disability. With the murders of Stevie, Christopher, and Michael, and the talk of sacrifice, it is important that we address one of Damien Echols' greatest influences, Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, an occultist, practiced magic of sex, drugs, and sacrifice. Crowley was known to the occult and was fascinated by blood, torture, and sexual degradation. Here's a few statements Crowley made about child sacrifice. Just two highlights from the book Magic in Theory and Practice. He writes, "For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim." He later goes on to state, "But the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious, and for nearly all purposes human sacrifice is the best." Now, apologists claim that Crowley wasn't literally speaking of sacrificing children, but was referring to masturbation. However, it was a claim that Damien would not dispute in trial while questioned by prosecutor Brent Davis. In trial, Davis asked Damien if he knew about Aleister Crowley. Damien answered that he knew of Crowley but knew very little about him. Davis told Damien that Crowley believed in human sacrifice, in which Damien responded that Crowley also believed he was a god. An interesting response, since Damien claimed to know very little about him, and in one of his own writings he claimed that when he drank blood he felt like a god. Davis asked Damien if he knew that Crowley found children to be the best type of sacrifice. Damien agreed. Davis then presented him with a piece of paper with Damien's handwriting. On the paper was translated coded alphabets. On it was the name of his girlfriend, Dominique, his best friend, Jason, his infant son, Seth, and a man he claimed he knew very little of, but didn't know much about, Aleister Crowley. Davis asked Damien when he translated the coded names. Damien claimed it was before his arrest. Brent asked him if he was sure it wasn't while he was in jail, and Damien timidly responded that it might have been. Again, Damien continues to get called out on his lies. Davis asked Damien if he translated the alphabet codes while he was in jail, and Damien meekly responded, "If you say so." Damien would eventually admit that he translated the codes while he was in jail. Damien knew he was caught in a lie after being so arrogant just minutes before. The names Damien translated all had some importance in his life. Dominique was his girlfriend, Jason was his best friend, and Seth was his son. To have their names listed along with Crowley and to claim that he had no influence, it just didn't add up. Years later, in Life After Death, Damien would admit how influential Crowley was and still is in his life. Crowley was heavily into black witchcraft and attempted to summon demons and other spirits. He didn't believe in God or Satan, but that didn't make his beliefs and actions any less disturbing or evil. Damien would go back and forth on the whole devil worshipping aspect, but he confirmed he was involved in demonology and believed in the power that blood had, especially when consumed. Again, Damien said that he consumed blood and it made him feel like a god. He also claimed to be possessed by a spirit of a woman murdered by her husband. Interesting correlations for someone he knew of but didn't really know. On March 19, 1994, Damien was convicted of 3 counts of capital murder and sentenced to die by lethal injection. In conclusion, Damien would create a self-fulfilled prophecy. In his progress report, Damien stated that he could be another Ted Bundy or Charles Manson. In the same report, he stated that he wanted to influence the world. At the end of Paradise Lost, the childhood murders at Robin Hood Hills, Damien said that at a young age, he knew people were going to know who he was. He enjoyed his newfound fame because he said even after he's dead, people would talk about him forever. He basked at the idea of parents telling their children stories about him as the West Memphis Boogeyman. He relished the idea that children would fearfully look under their beds, thinking he might be under there. Damien loved the attention of the trial. He blew kisses at the parents of the murdered children and smirked, sneered, and licked his lips seductively at onlookers and the media. Patricia Liggett, Damien's aunt, recalled a time when he told her that the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world was to become famous. Well, Damien got his wish. He was covered by the media and a documentary series that highlighted his trial and aftermath to the entire world. He became famous, and not only did activists and a groupie wife fall at his feet, but so did celebrities, filmmakers, and musicians who invested their money to set him and his 2 other friends free. They spent possibly tens of millions of dollars to hire the same forensic experts who got O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony off of murder convictions. Damien has a following that could rival the cult status of Charles Manson. The difference? Damien was freed, while Manson, who also maintained his innocence, rotted for the rest of his days in captivity. In August of 2011, Val Price, Damien's original defense attorney, was asked if he thought his former client was innocent. Price squinted his eyes, shook his head, and said that it was hard to say. A very interesting statement coming from a man who defended him back in 1994. Today, Damien is living the American dream. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He recently wrote a book on magic. He has credits as a movie producer. At one time, he tattooed X's on groupies for a fee. He got to rub elbows with the likes of filmmakers Peter Jackson and musician Eddie Vedder, and that's just to name a few things. Christopher Byers, Stevie Branch, and Michael Moore don't get to live a dream. Their innocent blood eventually gave Damien the fame he always wanted. What could be more tragic than that? What could be more outrageous? Is that justice? Yeah, just a misunderstood kid with eccentric tastes. Bullshit. Jason Baldwin has been described as a shy and mild-mannered young man by Jason's former defense attorney, Paul Ford. Jason's friends and family described him the same way. They said he made good grades and looked after his family. Others have brought up his slender physical appearance as evidence that there's no way that a kid like that could ever be capable of such a horrific crime. If history taught us anything, it is that we should never judge a book by its cover. There's a Japanese parable about people having three faces. The first face you show to the world. The second face you show to your friends and family. The third face you never show to anyone you want alive, and it is the truest reflection of who you are. In this case, anyone who thought that they knew Jason, they were wrong. Under the influence of an older friend's disturbing fantasy, Jason would prove to be very capable of murder. Look, take Jeffrey Dahmer, for instance. Many, including a prom date named Bridget Geiger, considered Dahmer to be a shy and polite person. Dahmer came from a broken home, had issues with alcohol, and messed around with dead animals, but no one ever considered him violent to other people. Like Dahmer, Jason also came from a broken home. In addition, he would vandalize property, and he stole, so not quite the saint others try to make him out to be. Now, how about Ted Bundy? He was intelligent and bright. He was, very kind to people. He knew both professionally and socially. He volunteered at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Center to talk people out of killing themselves. At the end of the shift, he would walk Anne Rule, a fellow volunteer, to her car at night to make sure that she made it there safely. Not only did she believe he was initially innocent of rape and murder, but so did all his co-workers. People talked highly of Bundy. He was well respected in social and political circles. Clearly and surely no one like him could do such a thing. He's so nice. Of course, we know that's not the case. The point of these examples are to prove that just because someone doesn't look or act like they are capable of murder doesn't mean that they aren't capable. Murderers, they come in all shapes and sizes. And you have to assess everything case by case. Just because Jason is mild-mannered and shy to them or to you doesn't mean he wasn't capable of a horrific crime. And I assure you he was. Here's the thing. We can place Jason at the crime based on two things. 1, Jessie's multiple confessions. 2, Damien told Jennifer Bearden and Jason's girlfriend at the time, Heather, that Jason was with him that night. Let's go back to Jennifer. On May 5th, 1993, sometime around 5:30 p.m., she stated that she called Jason's house and talked to both him and Damien, and he told her that they were going out and that Jason's mother, Gail Grinnell, was going to drive them somewhere. Damien didn't specify where that somewhere was. As we already know, Damien and Jason's whereabouts were unaccounted for between the hours shortly after 5:30 p.m. and sometime before 10 p.m. It's accounted for that Gail worked that evening from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., making it impossible that Jason's mother drove them anywhere. It's interesting that Damien would lie about that part. However, we still know that they were together because Damien talked to Heather, Jason's, like I said, girlfriend at the time, on the phone around 10:30 p.m., telling her that he was walking around with Jason. Now, you want to hear something that's strange? In a 2008 affidavit, Heather stated that one of the murder victims, Christopher Byers, was at her house sometime that day on May 5th, 1993. Pretty strange, right? Another missing piece to connect to the overall puzzle. Just really, really bizarre. So let's go back to Gail. Let's talk more about her. Gail Grinnell, didn't want her son talking to police. When the West Memphis police detectives tried to talk to Jason along with Damien and Dominique on May 9th of 1993, Gail flipped out. She told the detectives that she didn't want them talking to her son. The detectives tried reasoning with her, but Gail refused. The detectives had no choice but to leave. Look, Gail was well within her rights, but her actions were anything, you know, it was anything other that of a mother who felt her son was innocent, but rather it seemed like a mother who would protect her son at any cost. Why wouldn't she want Jason to answer questions and give his alibi? Why wouldn't she want her son to give whatever information to police to rule him out as either a person of interest or as a suspect? In September 23rd, 1993, there was an interview that John Fogelman did. He's one of the state prosecutors. He asked Gail why she was so belligerent to the detectives that day. So Fogelman asks, okay, can you tell me why you got so upset that day that the police were talking to Jason and Damien and Dominique out in front of your trailer? Angela replies, because they had a lot of rumors going around about them and had gotten me upset. So Fogelman asks, okay, I see. Then you didn't want the police talking to Jason? And Angela replies, no. Keep in mind, too, I should probably state, Gail is also known as Angela, so I want to make sure that's clear. Sorry for any confusion. I should have clarified that up front. So Fogelman, he asks, okay, can you tell me why? And Angela, or Gail, whatever you want to call her, she replies, I thought that Damien was guilty or something, and I didn't want, Jason running around with him. Fogelman asks, you didn't want Jason running around with Damien? Angela responds, look, I know they're innocent. I know they're all innocent. And Fogelman's like, all right, well, did Jason tell you anything that scared you? Angela responds, no. Fogelman asks, are you sure? And she says, I'm sure. So Angela, we'll just say Gail just to keep it clear. She thought Damien was initially guilty and didn't want her son hanging out with him. She knew if Jason could be placed with Damien that evening, then it was game over. Now, Jason told Gail he was walking to Walmart with Ken Watkins, allegedly, but we know that's a lie because the previous statements made by Jennifer and Heather. Damien told them he was with Jason, so that, there's no doubt, places Damien with Jason that night, and there was no one else that could, other than Jessie, that can hold them together. Period. Here's something that's pretty interesting. Jessie Baldwin, Jason's grandmother on his father's side, wasn't at all surprised with Jason's involvement. In the June 5th edition of the Memphis Commercial Appeal, she stated, I thought in my own mind when those boys were killed that my grandson is sort of superstitious about that devil stuff, said Jessie Mae Baldwin. He was always catching lizards and snakes, and I thought something was going on in that child's mind. Now Baldwin, who is 76, said that she and her husband, Perd Baldwin, who was 82, learned of her grandson's arrest from a television report Friday morning. She says, we just looked at each other, and I said, I don't know what that boy has on his mind, killing those people like that. So, pretty crazy. You have Jason's grandparents who thought he did it, and then you have Gail, who at least admitted that she thought Damien had something to do with it. And of course, you have to understand she had to change her mind on that, because if it could be proven that Damien and Jason were together, it hurts Jason. So, something to consider. In Paradise Lost, The Childhood Murders at Robin Hood Hills, Paul Ford asked Jason if he were on the jury, would he have found Damien guilty? So Ford asked, if you were on that jury, would you have a hard time letting him go? Jason answers, yeah. Ford reaffirms, I would too. In fact, it should be telling that Paul Ford's strategy wasn't to prove his client innocent, but to prove reasonable doubt. So, other than Jason's own attorney believing that Damien was guilty, he found Jason's alibis inconsistent. Jason, his mother, uncle, brother, and friends gave different accounts of his whereabouts on the evening of May 5th, 1993. The alibis were so unreliable that Ford wisely decided not to use them because they would not hold up in cross-examination. We know Damien placed Jason with him that night. In addition, Ford wasn't comfortable with everything that Damien's counsel did at the time. It certainly hurt putting Damien on the stand, and Paul wasn't going to make that mistake with Jason. Damien's attorneys were set to prove their client innocent. But Ford's strategy wasn't to prove Jason's innocence. Instead, he wanted to establish reasonable doubt by poking holes in the state's argument. Here's a statement by Ford in his closing argument. That's what they want right there. Guilt by association. Because he's sitting over there with Damien, they want you to convict him. Because he has a best friend or a good friend, they want you to convict him. Do you share the beliefs of all your friends? Do you do everything all the time with all of your friends? Do some of your friends have beliefs that are different from yours? Do they do things that you don't want to do or don't think is correct? That's not right. Guilt by association is a horrible thing. But that's what they want in this case. They want you to think he's an accomplice, and giving you that instruction that says an accomplice, so they can convict Jason without any evidence because of the evidence against somebody else. But that instruction says you must find that they aided, agreed to aid, or attempted to aid in order to find that they're an accomplice. And where is that evidence? Well, ignoring Jesse's multiple confessions, the fact that Damien places Jason with him that night implicates him as an accomplice. It is clear that Damien had influence over Jason. Jason's neighborhood friend, Samuel Dwyer, had insight into Jason's relationship with Damien. In his affidavit, he said Jason bought a black trench coat after meeting Damien and even started to talk like him. It's well documented that Jason followed Damien almost everywhere. Damien was the older of the two, and Jason obviously looked up to him. It is logical to conclude that Damien assimilated Jason, at least in a lot of ways, into the way in his way of thinking over a period of time. Jason also helped Damien when he attempted to run away with his ex-girlfriend Deanna Holcomb. Now, even Damien said at one point, Jason would never give me up. So there you go.
Now, the West Memphis Three Revelations blog also posted an entry that we should examine. It's regarding forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland's statements on common dynamic among team killers. She writes, many couples, no matter what gender, tend to follow a similar pattern. Two people meet and feel a strong attraction, or they are related and have established an intimate familiarity with each other that allows them to share fantasies, even violent ones. Typically, one is dominant, and that one seduces the other into sharing his or her fantasy, and then into acting it out. This perfectly describes people like Sheila and Rachel, the murderers of Skylar Niece. You can clearly see this with Damien and Jason, and Jessie to a certain degree. Damien was the leader while Jason and Jessie were the followers. Damien's fantasies of what it would be like to torture and murder someone is what led to this crime. It's more probable than not that if Jason and Jessie weren't friends with Damien, they most likely don't commit this kind of murder. Sure, I'm speculating, I know that, but doing so is based on solid trends and research. As little evidence as there was at the crime scene due to the bodies, clothes, and objects submerged in water for about 18 hours. Red fibers, microscopically similar with a bathrobe found in Baldwin's home, it was found on the victims. And in 2012, the West Memphis Three group of all stars in the defense team attempted to refute this claim. But keep in mind that these are the same group of jackals who got O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony off. Forgive me. So, like I said, forgive me if I find their findings slanted because the fibers decayed over the years and the original criminalist who examined them was dead and cannot defend the attacks against her original findings. Just saying. So, this next part is about Michael Carson. He was someone who was in jail with Jason, and according to Michael, Jason confessed the crimes to him. Now, in the initial episode that I did, I was kind of on the fence about Michael Carson's confession. However, going back and looking more into it, I actually became a bit more convinced that I believe it to be credible. So I asked Roberta Glass if I could use an interview she did with me regarding Jason Baldwin, and she graciously said yes. So I'm going to share that part about Michael Carson because I believe what I said in her interview is far better than what was in my previous episode. So have a listen.
What are the circumstances of Michael Carson's confession? How did that come about, and why don't people believe it, do you think?
Well, why they don't believe it or why they do believe it?
Oh, maybe that's a better question. Why did the jury believe Jason Baldwin's confession to Michael Carson?
Well, for the naysayers, I understand that jailhouse snitching is usually unreliable, but sometimes they are. I know it worked in the Manson case, and I think people need to consider the details. So let's kind of go over it. So Michael Carson, he was in jail at the Craighead County Detention Center in early August of 1993. He was there for about a week or about a week and a half, and Jason was already in jail. Carson was in 48-hour lockdown before he was able to mingle with other inmates. And once he was out, he was able to hang out in that break room. He described it as a small break room, and that's where he first met Jason. Carson, along with Jason and some other teams, they would play spades. Now, here's an interesting point. Carson brought up when he was interviewed is that there were three kids, they would start messing with Jason, and Carson would actually stand up for him by saying that if you got a problem with him, you got a problem with me. So here you got three of them and you got one of Jason. So I'm sure that had a hand in Jason trusting Carson. There's strength in numbers. So especially in an incarcerated setting, you tend to get close to people. And Carson was willing to stand up and fight for Jason if push came to shove. So the first time Carson asked Jason, hey, did you do it? Did you kill those three little boys? Jason said no. But the next day, they had just called the inmates into their cells for lunch. And Carson asked again, he's like, hey, man, just between you and me, did you do it? And Baldwin answered, yeah, I did it. So they had about 2 minutes to talk about it, according to Carson. So Jason told
Carson, some really sick details of the crime regarding Christopher Byers' genitals. And he said that Damien did the same gross things alongside with him, which, again, I hate saying it, but, putting the balls in their mouth.
Sucking the blood from the head of the penis. I mean, really vile, vile, vile things. Yeah.
Yeah. And he also said, Jason said to him that when he gets out of there, he's going to kick Jessie Misskelley's ass for confessing. And Jason also told Carson that, I'm going to walk straight out of here. They ain't got nothing on me, no evidence. And then when I get out, my parents are going to throw me a big party. I mean, Carson was disgusted. He slammed his hand on the table and was like, man, I don't want nothing to do with you. And, Carson, he eventually, he gets out of the detention center and, he doesn't mention it again until many months later. And so the first person he told was his dad. They were watching TV and he was on the couch. He told his dad what Jason did because it was being covered. And he said, Jason admitted it to me. And his dad asked him, he's like, you need to take a lie detector test and, go talk to the cops. Now, at first, he told his dad, I don't want to get involved, but his dad pushed him to do the right thing. So the next day, Carson's dad called the prosecuting attorney, which was Brent Davis. They went to his house and they talked to him. And Carson told Brent Davis that Jason looked him straight in the eye and told him that, yeah, he did it. So let's look into why the testimony is credible. I mean, one, he passed a polygraph test, and I know polygraph tests aren't admissible, and yes, they can be wrong. I've seen it in other situations. Also depends who's doing the test, and sometimes that can be interpretive, but he didn't fail it. Now, number two, he didn't want to get involved. And I think that's something that people have to consider. He wasn't trying to interject himself into it.
Very good point.
His dad had to talk him into it. And three, Carson had nothing to gain in testifying. He wasn't in jail. There wasn't any opportunity to reduce a sentence for anything. And there was no reward money. So people will bring up things in the future. Like, I understand that there was a witness who claimed that Michael Carson told him that the confession was false, but Michael Carson in that article said that wasn't true. Then, of course, now you have West Memphis, which the filmmakers try to make it look like Carson was trying to say that it was not a real confession, or Jason's confession wasn't real as he told him. But that's not what he said. He just said, I was messed up on drugs. He apologized to Jason, which was weird, but he never said it was fake. As far as I know to this day, Michael Carson has never recanted that confession, and I believe it to be real. And so did the jury. The jury also thought it was credible.
Jason Baldwin, this is interesting. In his first post-conviction interview, he said that he was in holding 48 hours on lockdown and never talked to Carson. I think he also believed Carson was in lockdown the entire time, and so there would have been no way that they would have talked to each other. But then there was another interview where he said that they did share the same space, or they probably shared the same space. So think about this. If Baldwin or Carson were on lockdown and were isolated, you would think any lawyer Jason ever had up until his release would be able to verify those facts. But instead, they don't go after that. They go after the credibility of the testimony. Not if they ever shared the same space. Think about that. Let's talk about the lake knife. On November 17th of 1993, a survival knife was discovered by law enforcement in a lake directly behind Jason's trailer. The knife was relevant because the discovered object was consistent with a weapon used to inflict some of the injuries found on the victims' bodies. Despite the discovery, West Memphis Three supporters and attorneys gave various theories on how the knife ended up in the lake, completely ignoring the rule of Occam's razor. Damien and Jason's attorneys claimed that the knife was planted by police and didn't belong to Jason. Later, their theory changed as the defense claimed that the prosecution knew the knife was in the lake because the knife was thrown in the water a year before the murders. Samuel Dwyer claimed that Gail Grinnell threw the knife in the lake because she didn't want Jason to have knives. So we have different accounts here, and the only thing I have to ask is why the sudden change? Why didn't Jason admit the knife was his to begin with? Dennis Dint, Gail's boyfriend at the time, claimed to have seen Jason with a knife that fit the description of the lake knife. It's important to know that Dennis lived at Gail's for a month or two around the time of the murders. Jason confirmed this in his Rule 37 hearing years after his conviction. The issue of how the knife ended up in the lake would only continue to get more bizarre. Gail, who I also told you before goes by the name Angela, would give two completely different accounts on a West Memphis Three Facebook group on how the knife ended up in the lake. So in one of the posts, she writes, I want to say I never threw a knife in the lake. My children had no knives. I didn't allow it. By accident, a year earlier, Jason threw one in the middle of the lake because I wouldn't let him have it. My children had no knives at the time of the murders of those children. I can't make it any clearer or plainer. So Gail claimed that Jason threw the knife into the lake, an interesting statement since it was claimed that the knife was previously believed to be planted evidence. And Gail would go on to talk about that theory. I have one thing to say. I had a neighbor 2 doors down from me who was friends with Officer Murray, a Marion juvenile officer. He told me himself he knew she did crack and visited her house often. Maybe he was the one who threw the knife in the lake. About 6 months before these murders happened, he flagged me down on the street at Lakeshore and asked me to go out and have a beer with him. I told him I didn't drink. Then he wanted me to have coffee with him. He knew me and my husband were separated. Was this vengeance for me not going out with him? So, Gail went back to the theory that Jason was framed by the police because she turned down Officer Murray. Does that sound logical to any of you? Murray was so upset that Gail didn't accept his advances that she framed her son of murder. The idea is so damn preposterous that it belongs in an Oliver Stone movie. The thing about the internet is that everything you post can and come back to haunt you. It is inconceivable to make 2 entirely different stories and then claim that you can't make it any clearer or plainer. Was the knife Jason's or was it not? Was it thrown in the lake by Gail or Jason? Was it thrown in the lake before or after the murders? Was it planted by a scorned police officer or not? I can't make these questions any clearer or plainer, so which is it? The story of when and how the knife ended up in the lake once again differs from Gail and Samuel's statements. Matt Baldwin, Jason's younger brother, placed the knife in the lake after the murders. In addition to the survival knife that was found in the lake, Jason had his younger brother trade additional weapons to other friends because police suspected him of the Robin Hood Hills murders. So, in an online chat, Matt, under the handle Smudge, gave another statement of how the survival knife ended up in the lake. He placed the knife in the lake after the murders because police suspected Jason. Of course, the most damaging piece of evidence is Jessie Misskelley's multiple confessions, placing the knife in Jason's hand. He confessed that it was Jason, not Damien, and not Jessie, who cut off Christopher Byers' testicles and removed the skin of the penis. We know Jason is capable because he has experience of skinning snakes and other animals. The type of knife in Jesse's account was a lock blade, but let's also understand he was drunk on whiskey. Did he just get it wrong? He could have remembered it wrong. And keep in mind, Jesse's confessions couldn't be used in the Baldwin Echols trial, but hindsight still reveals it as a whole, and that shouldn't be discounted now or ever. There's also no telling if Jason had more than one knife with him. So I would also like to bring up that lake knife and some of the wounds that it caused the victims. A while back, a longtime West Memphis Three researcher, Sean Wheeler, took another look on what had been described as a human bite mark on Stevie Branch's forehead. I remember this being on several West Memphis Three blogs, and it was a big topic on several Facebook groups years ago. I'll quote the West Memphis Three Facts webpage regarding this topic. Wheeler had 2 forensic odontologists, and that's dentists in layman terms, Compare the wound to the missing compass slot on the handle of the lake knife. Now, according to Wheeler, forensic odontologists Homer Campbell and Peter Loomis, they're both experts in both tool mark and bite mark identification. Here's what Campbell and Loomis reported back. So, Campbell responds, I believe the injuries to the left forehead and upper lid of the left eye were produced by the knife recovered or one similar. I also sent the photos of the injuries and the knife to another for evaluation, and he agrees. Here is what Loomis reports back. Bingo! The circular mark sure looks like the butt of the survival knife. The measurements fit. The diameter of the injury is 33 millimeters, and the diameter of the prominent circular area of the butt of the knife is 29.8. The 3 lacerations under the eyebrow look like they were made by the serrations on the back of the knife. The measurements also fit here. The lacerations measure 11.2 millimeters between them, and the serrated points on the knife vary between 11.1 and 11.4. Of course, the photo with the wooden ruler is blurry as far as depicting these serrations, but I can still measure them. Also worth noting, the lake knife's missing compass may have had a metal pin. Some have speculated that the metal pin could have caused the X mark injury in the center of Stevie's forehead. Fogelman also clearly demonstrated in court that the lake knife could replicate the wound patterns found on the bodies. Now, the defense argued that demonstrating it on fruit wasn't scientific, but I mean, come on. You can use it on wood, fruit, flesh, or whatever, and those patterns are going to leave those same impressions. It's comical to think otherwise. So, on March 19th, 1994, Jason Baldwin was found guilty on 3 counts of murder. The court sentenced Baldwin to life in prison. On August 19th of 2011, along with Damien and Jessie, they accepted the Alford plea, a guilty conviction in where they can maintain innocence but concede that the state had enough evidence to convict them, and by doing so, they get to go free. Many will claim Jason always maintained his innocence even to this very day, but you know what? That means shit to me. How did this whole West Memphis Three innocence movement thing start? Well, it started in 1996 with the documentary Paradise Lost. It was directed, produced, and edited by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinitsky and distributed by HBO. According to Berlinger, he thought they were making a film about bad children, the inside story of why kids kill, and its ultimate purpose to protect children. That's how it was also pitched to the victims' families, hence why they agreed to appear in it. They too wanted to raise awareness so that this hopefully can never happen to anyone else again. However, the filmmakers would eventually change their tune. According to Berlinger in a Huffington Post interview back in 2012, he stated, well, the first few months they spent with the victims' families, it made them even more convinced that the kids were guilty. But then they negotiated access to meet Damien, Jason, and Jessie in prison, and everything changed. They started drawing a different conclusion. Some of these conclusions were based in pure conjecture instead of facts. One of the stupid reasons was, well, Jason was too skinny. They felt like Jason couldn't possibly have done it because he had skinny arms. You know, that is absolutely absurd and ludicrous. I'll give you an example. I'm pretty sure if Skylar Neese was alive today, she could tell you how her 2 skinny former besties, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, had no problem stabbing her to death with their skinny little arms. This idea that you have to lift weights or be of a certain weight in order to kill someone, just pure, it's idiocy. Anyway, after meeting the West Memphis Three, the filmmakers quickly went from neutral storytellers to impassioned advocates. The film left out crucial details, which I detailed in previous episodes, and even made provable errors. For example, the West Memphis Police Department interrogated Jessie for over 12 hours before he confessed to the crimes. Jessie confessed 4 hours and 20 minutes into questioning. To summarize, Paradise Lost was a film with the intent to leave doubt about the convictions. They cherry-picked what they wanted for the purpose to get people talking and debating about the justice system and that witch hunt mob mentality. No longer was the intent of the film about why kids kill or protecting those children. This became quite clear when the filmmakers had the audacity to show uncensored crime scene footage of the murdered boys laying on the ground, hogtied and fully nude. It was exploitation at its worst. As far as raising doubt of who killed Stevie, Michael, and Christopher, the first documentary was mild compared to Part 2, Paradise Lost, Revelations. Joe and Bruce made no room for doubt about the West Memphis Three's innocence this time. The documentary, if you can even call it that, had their protagonists. The misunderstood Damien, Jason, and Jessie, and the heroic and brave supporters who formed the support website WM3.org. They also had their antagonist, John Mark Byers, the stepfather of Christopher Byers. This time, they focus on him as an alternative suspect. A good part of Revelations showed John Mark Byers hamming it up for the camera, taunting Echols as he walked past for an appeal hearing, or trashing the West Memphis Three supporters. Byers would commonly wax Shakespearean throughout all his scenes. The most uncomfortable for me was when he returned to the crime scene, made 3 mock graves of Jason, Damien, and Jessie, and lit it on fire. Revelations also planted a seed on whether John Mark Byers could have had something to do with the death of his wife Melissa. The film succeeded making John Mark Byers a villain, and Byers made it very easy for them. It was later discovered that Byers was paid to behave this way, and he sold his soul and did so without any hesitation. He enjoyed the attention and loved putting on a show. He was a villain, but he wasn't responsible for the murders. The film also had the returning Dan Stidham, the lawyer of Jessie Misskelley, who continued to champion for Jessie as he sought out alternative means to the wounds found on the boys' bodies. That's where criminal profiler Brent Turvey comes in. In short, the alternative theory is that most of the wounds on the slain children came from animals. Another focus was an interpreted human bite mark. The film speculated if the bite mark came from Byers. It becomes a well-convenient mystery due to Byers now wearing dentures and giving different reasons why his teeth were gone. The film ends with Byers passing a polygraph. Byers gloats, but based on the aftermath, many West Memphis Three supporters still believe he was responsible. And it did nothing to end speculation. Before we get into the third documentary, Mara Leverett, author and journalist, who writes more like an advocate would, also focused on John Mark Byers as a suspect. She wrote Devil's Knot, published in 2002. She ignored prudent details like the fact that Byers had an alibi. Still, can't let facts get in the way of a good story. Okay, so between Paradise Lost Parts 2 and 3, a tsunami of celebrity support came crashing in. We're talking Peter Jackson, Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder, Henry Rollins, Trey Parker, Matt Stone, the Dixie Chicks, Marilyn Manson, Dave Navarro, and many others started a call to action to free the West Memphis Three. Millions were raised to do that, and this leads into Paradise Lost Purgatory. In it, the filmmakers highlighted the first 2 documentaries before going into the updates of that time. After being caught up, we find that Damien Echols' defense team, paid for by supporters and celebrities, hired some renowned forensic scientists to collect DNA and other evidence that had never been tested during the 1994 trials in hopes of getting a new one. It also goes into the possibility of jury misconduct. The story also covered John Mark Byers, once a suspect in the court of public opinion, now a reformed and well-embraced West Memphis Three supporter. The film also shifts from one stepfather to another, this time being Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch. Hobbs becomes the new villain of the story due to a tiny hair found on one of the ligatures. The mtDNA couldn't rule him out as the source of that hair. Another hair discovered by a tree stump also couldn't rule out Terry's friend at the time, David Jacoby. I'll get into that along with other DNA testing later. In addition, the film scrutinizes Terry's past the same way it did with John Mark Byers. They used Terry's issues with Pam and her family to raise concerns. Also, this time, Pam no longer believed that the West Memphis Three killed her son. Now, she doesn't come right out and say Terry did it, but her family does. And that's something that we do need to discuss because there are some weird commonalities between Terry Hobbs and John Mark Byers. And people try to use this as a reason that that person is a murderer. And I'll give you an example of that. John Mark Byers' ex-wife's family called the West Memphis Police Department claiming he may have committed the murders. While Pam's family believed Terry may have committed the crimes, they never called the police to raise those suspicions in that time period. Their accusations on Terry most likely comes from just the very ugly issues Terry and Pam were having, which at the time got really bad. Also, Byers' alibis would be scrutinized. For example, Byers had alibis contradicted by his stepson Ryan Clark and the Gardners. People use instances like this to accuse him, and it's no different than Terry, who got some details wrong, well over a decade after the murders when questioned about it. You don't have to like Mark or Terry for their past. You don't have to like their characters, but it's important to separate that with the facts regarding the case and who's actually responsible for the murders. Anyways, the film concludes with the granted evidentiary hearing set for December of 2011, but we get a shocking surprise. The West Memphis Three are released in August 2011 due to the rare Alford plea. And again, I've talked about this in other episodes, but what is an Alford plea? Well, it's a guilty plea in which the defendant maintains their innocence and does not admit to the criminal act that they were accused of, but admits that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to persuade a judge or jury to find the defendant guilty and thus agrees to be treated as guilty. Like it or not, it's a guilty plea. Now, while supporters proclaim some parents, which consisted of John Mark Byers and Pam Hobbs, no longer believe the West Memphis Three committed the crimes, it's important to point out that the majority of the families still believe that they did. This includes Todd and Dana Moore, Stevie Branch Sr., and Terry Hobbs. Now, with Melissa Byers, she passed away long before, so it's uncertain how she'd feel today or at that time of 2011. But she went to her grave believing that the West Memphis Three killed her son. Now, Paradise Lost Purgatory would later become nominated for an Oscar in 2012. I would like to read a letter from the Moores regarding the consideration of nomination. I believe this letter puts into perspective the nightmarish reality that the family faced compared to the fantasy sensationalism of these slanted documentaries. So, let me read it. Dear Chairman Epstein and members of the documentary branch of the Academy, we are Todd Moore and Dana Moore. Our cherished 8-year-old son, Michael, was brutally murdered on May 5th, 1993 by Jessie Misskelley, Damien Echols, and Jason Baldwin. Misskelley was tried and convicted in 1994. Baldwin and Echols were convicted by a separate jury later that year. All three entered Alford pleas to our son's murder August 19, 2011. They are now, as they have been for the past 17 years, guilty as a matter of law. They have been guilty as a matter of fact since the moment water flooded Michael's lungs after he was beaten, stripped, hogtied, and then discarded into a stream to drown. Michael was the joy of our lives. In addition to our son, his murderers also tortured and slaughtered 2 other children, Christopher Byers and Stevie Branch. These 3 precious victims were classmates and friends, and their loss was a tragedy felt throughout the entire community. We are horrified to learn that a documentary that glorifies Michael's killers, Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory, is among 15 documentaries being considered for an Academy Award. Because of public pressure, that exploded due to gross misrepresentations of fact in 2 previous documentaries. Michael's killers were unjustly able to enter into a plea agreement, were released from prison, and now pose additional threats to society. This third documentary further insulted the families of these three boys and may lead to further injustice. We implore the Academy not to reward our child's killers and the directors who have profited from one of the greatest frauds ever perpetuated under the guise of a documentary film. We realize that documentaries have a point of view and advocate a position to some degree or another. As with the two before it, the film crossed the line into a cruel hoax that had real-life consequences larger than even those of us who still mourn our horrific losses. It is not art. This film is cynical and exploitative deception that compounds our pain needlessly and rewards those who inflicted it. It and the two films that preceded it are simply tasteless tabloid entertainment presented as a social commentary. We are private individuals. The directors are aware of this because we refused to participate in their last two films. We appeared solely in the first film because the directors lied and told us their purposes would be to protect children. You can imagine our shock and disgust when the first film opened with gruesome and gratuitous images of the crime scenes and remained exploitive as salacious until the credits rolled. It did nothing to promote child welfare. It did everything to support child killers and to benefit monetarily from a ghastly crime. We are hardly the only people they misled or manipulated. Consider what happened to John Mark Byers. He was Christopher Byers' adoptive father. Confrontations between Mr. Byers and Echols supporters at hearings were staged. Of course, Joe and Bruce were there to film these episodes, and they would transport Mr. Byers to the hearings and wire him for sound beforehand. Furthermore, Berlinger and Sinitsky maneuvered Mr. Byers and Echols supporters in order to film the anticipated confrontations. Later, after the cameras were packed away, Mr. Byers acted like a different person. Instead of being belligerent, he was affable. When asked about his change in demeanor, Mr. Byers stated that he was supposed to act that way when the cameras were present. Mr. Byers was quoted as saying he received $500 per hour for exclusive interviews. These contrived confrontations and other distortions caused many viewers to believe Mark was the real killer. It had a terrible impact on his life. We brought this to the attention of HBO. Our complaint was ignored because these falsehoods proved lucrative. The complete list of distortions would take a long one. The above examples is illustrative of the manipulation and distortions that are prevalent throughout the entire Paradise Lost franchise. The films are bereft of ethics, principles, or factual accuracies and basis. Publicity from the first two films did generate millions of dollars in donations. Much of that money went towards the defense investigation of the case. Not a single piece of exploratory evidence was produced. In other words, between 10 million and 20 million has been collected, although no one knows the exact amount collected or how it was spent. In 18 years, nothing was found to clear the names of the actual killers. Late last year, the windfall that went toward the legal defense resulted in the granting of an evidentiary hearing, which was set to be held a few weeks from now. Instead, the murderers opted to initiate a plea negotiation with the state. As a result, they remain convicted of the deaths of 3 children. We have to note that this situation is similar to the one that confronted the Academy when Capturing the Freedmans was nominated for Best Documentary Film of 2003. 2 of the Freedmans' sexual abuse victims presented another open letter to the Academy. Capturing the Freedmans had much more artistic merit and integrity than Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory, yet it did not receive the award. The Academy made the right decision then, and we pray it does so at this time as well. Sincerely, Todd and Dana Moore. After Paradise Lost 3, another documentary came out called West Memphis, produced by Peter Jackson and directed by Amy Berg. The film covers a lot of what Paradise Lost Purgatory did, but more emphasis was put on Damien and Lori Davis's relationship. They also went after Terry Hobbs more aggressively. Now, let's talk about some of those involved in the West Memphis Three legal team. I'm not going to mention everyone, but some noteworthy ones. So you have the Innocence Project, who got involved, which was co-founded by Barry Scheck, one of the lawyers who defended O.J. Simpson at the criminal trial. He was one of the Dream Team attorneys who tried to discredit the integrity of the DNA found at Nicole Brown's residence, O.J.'s Bronco and O.J.'s property, both inside and out. So I'm going to let you think about that and think about O.J., think about that, and think about the integrity of a project like that. Just think about it. And you also have hotshot lawyer Dennis Ryadin. He took Damien Echols on as a client. He also represented murderer Phil Spector at one time. Gotta love a guy who's willing to represent scum like that. And then the West Memphis Three defense hired famous forensic pathologist Werner Spitz. Spitz would be known for testifying for the defenses in the trial of Casey Anthony and Phil Spector. Spitz would be known for a bit of controversy in a CBS Detroit interview and in a documentary interview about John Benet Ramsey in 2016. Spitz accused Burke Ramsey of killing his sister. Now, although the pathologist had not performed an autopsy on the girl, on October 6, 2016, Burke filed a defamation lawsuit against Spitz, seeking a total of $150 million in damages since Burke had never been considered a suspect by the Boulder police. In 2003, DNA evidence was found from an unidentified male that appeared to have cleared each family member from suspicion, as their DNA was excluded from matching. New DNA testing in 2016 revealed that there was DNA from two persons other than Joe Benet Ramsey. Spitz suggested that wild dogs feasted on Michael, Stevie, and Christopher while they were still alive and submerged underwater. He even said that these dogs grabbed the victims by their heads and slammed and shook them around, bashing their heads on rocks and such, causing the head injuries. And somehow these dogs magically dumped them back into the water. Yeah, do the mental gymnastics on that one. The West Memphis Three legal team would also hire world-renowned FBI profiler John Douglas. Douglas's profile seemed to custom fit a suspect to match Terry Hobbs. It's not the first time Douglas had done something like this and even got in trouble for it by doing it to a Canadian named Guy Paul Morin. The West Memphis Three Revelations blog goes into this in more detail, and I'll share the link in the descriptions below, but allow me to share a piece of it. At the time, investigators there working the murder of a girl named Christine Jessup and had a few suspects, but wanted help from Douglas to possibly help them steer the investigation. It was alleged that Douglas somehow found out about one of the suspects, a man named Guy Paul Morin, who was a neighbor of the girl. With this information, he tailored his profile to fit him. The investigators there was so impressed that the profile just so happened to match a suspect in every way, that they pushed Morin as a top suspect. Douglas then instructed the police that they should shake up the suspect and see what he does by releasing a profile to the media, and that this profile should match the suspect completely. So John then tailored a second profile that fit Morin even more closely than before. Then he gave this profile to the police, who broadcast it on TV. When it was broadcast, Morin's father mentioned to him that it sounded just like him. This appeared to be a joke, but the police used that to suggest that Morin was guilty of the crime, and that even his family was suspecting him. Douglas also told them how to question the suspect, saying they should have a giant photo of a fingerprint in the room, blown up nice and big to make it look like they had a match to his prints to the crime. He also said they should put filing cabinets in the room with Morin's name on it, big enough for him to read. So, as to give him the impression that they had a mountain of evidence against him, and thus he'd feel compelled to just give up and confess. The police would eventually arrest Morin, with many saying that they would never have done so had it not been for the brilliant and spot-on criminal profile which so closely matched him. Guy Paul Morin would spend several years behind bars, proclaiming his innocence until DNA finally proved that he was, just as he had always maintained, innocent. Christine Jessup's brother would later accuse Douglas of having custom fitted the profile to match Morin, which had led the investigation astray. The Canadian courts at one point wanted Douglas to testify about his work on the case in light of the allegation that he tailored his profile. However, Douglas chose not to even reply to messages left by the courts, and since he wasn't a Canadian citizen, they couldn't compel him to testify. In my opinion, that sounds like a chicken shit with no accountability who has no problems putting an innocent man behind bars. You know, a lot gets made out of FBI profilers, but they're not exactly always reliable. I would like to list a few FBI profiling that they got dead wrong. The person killing young blacks in Atlanta, Georgia, that was pronounced to be a white male, turned out that was in fact Wayne Williams, a black man. The DC Beltway sniper was pronounced to be a white military sniper. Was in fact a black former Army truck mechanic, John Allen Muhammad, and his 17-year-old accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski. They missed that one by a mile. They were just off by age, which I think was by 10 years, and also education. The Olympic bombing in Atlanta. They focused on the hero who found the bomb, Richard Jewell. Turned out it was a creep named Eric Rudolph. So yeah, forgive me if I don't think that these FBI profiling assholes are as accurate as these filmmakers and podcasters do. Like I always say, perception isn't always reality. Let's also go over some misconceptions that people and media have perpetuated over the last years. The state forcing the West Memphis Three to take the Alford plea. This is utterly false. The defense went to the new prosecutor, which was Scott Ellington, in the summer of 2011 and proposed the deal. Ellington accepted it, much to the dismay of some family members. No one forced the West Memphis Three to plead guilty. It was their representation's own idea. In the in-chambers hearing prior to the public Alford plea hearing on August 19, 2011, it is repeated by the state that the Alford plea was the brainchild of the defense. The defense didn't have to propose this plea to the state. If their case was so strong that it would have merited a new trial, why not do that and get full exoneration? Because they knew they didn't have a shot, and this became a game of poker with the new prosecutor, not experienced with this case, and the defense won that bluff. Some will try to claim, well, they took the deal because Damien was dying, and that's utter bullshit. Prove to me he was dying. What exactly was he dying from? It's all posturing and smoke and mirrors to justify the guilty plea. Again, I want proof that Damien was dying. But we all know I'm not going to get that, or any of us. None of us is going to get that. One of the big things I hear about all the time is that, well, if the West Memphis Three were really guilty, the state wouldn't have allowed them to walk free. Yeah, well, states do allow murderers to walk free. In 1966, Gertrude Benezeski was convicted of first-degree murder and life in prison for the torture and death of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. It even had a retrial where the result was the same. Still, a parole board in 1985 decided to free her, much to the dismay of Likens' family and the public. Not enough to convince you that they let murderers walk free? Well, how about Eric Smith, who at age 13 murdered a 4-year-old named Derek Robbie in 1993. He was convicted of second-degree murder in 1994 and sentenced to the maximum term then available for a juvenile murderer, a minimum of 9 years to life in prison. In October 2021, Smith was granted parole after 27 years of incarceration and was freed in early 2022. So yes, states do in fact let murderers walk free, even with a life sentence. Here's another one. Terry Hobbs' DNA was found at the crime scene. That's actually inconclusive. Thomas Fedor, forensic serologist hired by the West Memphis Three, stated that the hair on one of the ligatures could have come from Hobbs, but it was weak evidence. He would even state that he didn't believe it would be enough to convict Hobbs. So why is that? Well, At that time, 1.5% of the U.S. population could also be the source of that hair. That would be 4.5 million Americans at that particular time. For the sake of argument, let's say that it did belong to Terry. It wouldn't be strange at all due to secondary transfer. It's common for people who go to each other's houses and hang out or wherever they are. And again, the West Memphis Three Revelations blog explains it perfectly. According to case documents, there are additionally 26 other hairs found on the victims that could have originated from the biological parents and family members of the victims, but could not be set apart due to the type of DNA testing used. The only reason Hobbs was singled out was because he was a step-parent, and thus not biologically related, and as such could be shown that any hair that was attributed to him was not from one of the victims and make it appear like he was the odd one out. In 1993 and 1994, the prosecution DNA tested the evidence that they had against the family members of the victims, which included Terry Hobbs, who freely gave his DNA to be tested. At no time did Hobbs object, and his DNA is shown on this state crime lab report from 1994, having been given in October of 1993. Terry Hobbs has to date also provided his finger and palm prints to investigators, and neither the police or the defense could attribute any physical evidence to him. The only item the defense ever had was a single tiny hair fragment that likely isn't even his in the first place. Comparatively, there was DNA that could be attributed to the West Memphis Three, such as a t-shirt belonging to Jessie Misskelley that had a drop of human blood on it, which was consistent with the blood of Michael Moore. Human blood from two different people was also found mixed together on a necklace belonging to Damien Echols. When tested for DNA, the results showed one of the samples was Damien's own blood, and the second person's blood may have come from Stevie Branch. A DNA mixture also consistent with being from two people was located on the ligatures used to bind Stevie Branch. The results showed that it could have been Damien's DNA there as well, but those results were dismissed because other items during the same test were likely contaminated by those handling the bodies. Speaking of contamination, the West Memphis Three defense likes to play the inconclusive game to draw a conclusion of innocence. Bode Technology conducted a test of Stevie's ligatures and penile swab and Michael's penile swab. It was conducted by 3 independent analysts, and I really would like to focus on the last part of this report. In reviewing all of this data, it is noted that the quality and quantity of the results obtained are very limited and require extreme caution in interpretation. In rendering an opinion of this data, one cannot overlook the facts in this case. The 3 victims in this case were nude and submerged in water for nearly 18 to 24 hours prior to discovery. It is very unlikely that any interpretable DNA profile other than that due to the contamination or that of the victims would be recoverable. Based on the Bode's analysis letter, it is clear that the data provided is questionable at best. The analysis used possible and suggest to describe the data. Amy documents that there is clearly a possible mixture present, not a mixture present. She also indicates elevated baseline, primer peaks, and imbalance. It is clear that the data represented thus far by Bode, referenced above, is suspect at best. It is well documented that limited qualities of DNA, as noted in these samples and demonstrated by the quality of partial at best analysis obtained in this case, is too limited to render any opinion for comparison purposes. It is my opinion that the analysis and possible mixtures are due to contamination or effects, and no conclusive interpretation is possible. So there you have it. What you get in the end is pro-defense propaganda nonsense, which draws more attention than the truth, because sadly, we live in an age where content creators like documentary filmmakers are not challenged by the audience. They simply accept it at face value. The viewers just awe and gasp at what they're shown, not understanding that the content creators are doing what is comparable to a magician doing a clever parlor trick. And I think that's a good comparison.
A lot of true crime documentary filmmakers are like magicians. But no matter how impressive the trick is, it's an illusion, a clever deception. It's not real. Perception is not always reality. So I challenge you, the listener, be smart. Don't be afraid to look into what you are presented, because who you might be advocating for and taking pictures at some event just might be a killer. Until next time.